Check, check, check. Could the translators do a quick 5 to 10 count on English and then French? Thanks.
This is the English channel. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Going on the French channel now.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
That's great. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. We are going to get started. As we begin our meeting today, and on behalf of Ottawa City Council, I wish to acknowledge that Ottawa is built on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. The City of Ottawa honors the peoples and land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation and honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. I'll now ask the committee coordinator to do a roll call, please.
Councillor Lula,
Present.
Councillor Dudas, Councillor Curry,
Here.
Councillor Gower,
Here.
Councillor Tierney,
Present.
Councillor King,
Here.
Councillor Leeper,
Here.
Councillor Brockington,
Here.
Councillor Menard,
Here.
Councillor Giroux,
Here.
Vice Chair Kitts,
Here.
Mayor Sutcliffe.
Here.
You have quorum, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I'll note that Councillor Dudas did provide her regrets for this meeting. Are there any declarations of interest? Confirmation of minutes from the April 2nd meeting. Are the minutes confirmed? Finance and Corporate Services Department, the Conservation Authority's 2024 levies. Is that carried? Item 4.2, we have a presentation on that, so we'll hold that. Item 5.1 is the 2024 asset management plans, and there is a presentation on that as well. So we'll hold that. Item 6.1, Office of the City Clerk 2023 Annual Report. Is that carried? Item 6.2 is the City of Ottawa Municipal Accessibility Plan. Is that carried? Item 6.3 is the status update for Finance and Corporate Services Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending on the 26th of April. Is that received? Item 7.1 is the declaration of surplus land for 250 Forest Glade Crescent and transfer to Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition. We received a last minute request to speak from Mr. Allen. I'm not sure if he's present in the room or online. But I understand the other two delegations are supportive of the motion. So if you are. Okay, yes. So do you still want to speak even if the motion would be carried on consent? Do you still wish to speak? Otherwise, we can just carry the motion immediately. Okay, well, we'll hold the item then and come back to it. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back to item 4.2, administrative penalty system, and there's a presentation from the finance department. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, members of Finance and Corporate Services Committee. Today, I'm joined with my colleagues, Acting Director of Service Ottawa, Robert Giggy, and to my far right, Program Manager, Jesse Page, that's been leading this file. Today, I'm going to provide a quick presentation and provide a high-level overview, background, and the benefits of the administrative penalty system. What you'll see today, some of this information may be familiar because we did reach out to a number of councillors that were able to partake in a briefing review. Next slide, please. So the administrative penalty system allows municipalities to transition adjudication of certain infractions such as parking bylaw, automated speed enforcement infractions from the provincial court system to a city-controlled dispute resolution authority. More than 50 municipalities across Ontario, including Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, and Brampton, have adopted the administrative penalty system program in place for parking infractions for many years now, and are now moving forward with transitioning programs to include camera-based infractions. The Ontario Municipal Act 2001 was amended in 2007, OREG 333/7, permitting municipalities to establish a system of administrative penalty systems for the enforcement of minor bylaw infractions, including parking bylaws. Subsequently, the Ontario Highway Traffic Act was amended in 2022, Ontario Reg 355/22, to permit municipalities to establish a system of administrative penalties for the enforcement of camera-based infractions captured by the automated speed enforcement systems. The APS program is a prescribed by legislation program, and it's also used at all levels of government. Next slide, please. On this slide, we'll demonstrate and illustrate the current state versus the future state once the administrative penalty system is adopted. On the left side of the slide, this is the current state. So this is the current process from a Provincial Offences Act. Minor offenses such as red light camera infractions, automated speed enforcement infractions, parking offenses, part 2, and the serious offenses flow through the POA, the provincial court system. So in these scenarios, when an infraction is issued and an individual or someone would like to contest or dispute that, it flows through the provincial court system. It's a very onerous process where you would need to have a prosecutor and then ultimately reviewed by a justice of peace. Since the pandemic, what we've seen is the number of justice of peace officers available to the city has reduced substantially, which means that about 95% of our infractions at the City of Ottawa is related to those minor infractions from an ASC red light camera perspective and parking offenses. So we have a lot of tickets going through the dispute process, which is basically jammed up, for lack of a better word, in the current system. As we move into administrative penalty system, what this does, it allows those majority of the infractions from an ASC red light camera perspective and the parking offenses to move into the APS system, which the city would have control over in terms of the adjudication process. These would be reviewed first for dispute by a screening officer. Screening officers are employees of the city. Then if it goes to a further dispute, it's heard by a hearing officer. Hearing officers are not employees of the city. They are appointed by the clerk's office and city council with an onerous or defined process to make sure that there's fairness and equitable treatment of that dispute. What doesn't go through the administrative penalty system is all the other minor infractions outside of ASC and red light camera, and then the more serious infractions. So what that means is it frees up all that capacity from that 95% of the volume that flows through the POA today, comes out of the POA system. The provincial court systems now has more time to deal with more offensive infractions and allows the city to staff up and address that volume as needed as demand goes up and down. Next slide, please. Some of the key benefits by moving to the APS system is, I kind of mentioned this on the previous slide, matters are heard faster. Disputes will be heard within a few weeks or months. This offers a significant improvement when compared to the current process. So again, the current process is really, there's a significant backlog with the volume that's going through the court system. So that will free up all that capacity. There's less time required from the public. So if you do choose to dispute the infraction, you will be given a fixed time in terms of when that hearing will be provided. What we've seen through, as I mentioned previously, well over 15 municipalities across the province have already adopted this system. Their data shows that there is a significant reduction in the number of disputes that go through the process, freeing up more time. Public satisfaction, there is data that demonstrates, again, those municipalities that move to this system does show an improvement in terms of the public fairness. These are, again, the hearing officers are all legally trained and provided the method of resolving the penalty disputes. Process improvements. We have the ability to modernize our technology. So today, there's a couple systems that we need to kind of connect into at the provincial level as we go through the process. Tomorrow, bringing that in-house will allow us to have one system and kind of have some synergies there from some of the legacy systems. Also improvements in terms of the process and administrative side of the equation. And it still maintains the efficacy of the overall program. So again, the other last benefit was aligning the judicial resources to the more serious offenses that you see today. Next slide, please. So as the report outlines, the recommendation is to proceed with the administrative penalty system for City of Ottawa. As part of the process and regulations, we also are required to adopt bylaws related to this program. We need adoption of an APS bylaw, which formally authorizes the program and the defining processes, roles and responsibilities and penalties and fees of the program. We also need approval of the appointment bylaw, which authorizes the city of Ottawa's process to appoint those hearing officers. In addition, there's a recommendation to adopt the APS conflict of interest and prevention of political interference policies, which are in alignment with the statutory authority and existing legislative policy framework that applies to the conduct of members in council. Next slide, please. Next steps after today, once approved, it proceeds to council, and then we will start with the implementation process. We've also engaged a third-party consultant earlier as we were going through this review, to really look at lessons learned from the other municipalities that already adopted this program. And the recommendations from there is basically to start as a two-tier implementation perspective. So start off with the implementation of the parking infractions first, which is targeted for Q2 of 2025. And then by Q4, that should be 2025 on the slide, Q4, the ASC and the red light camera program would fold in then. So both components would be implemented by the end of 2025, starting with parking, followed up with ASC and red light camera. And that concludes the presentation today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Luloff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. If somebody wishes to go through the justice of the peace, can they elect to do so rather than going through the administrative process under this new system?
Mr. Mayor, no, once we transition over to the APS system, now this will be a new process that they had to flow through. There will be a little bit of a cutover in terms of the parallel. Two systems will run in parallel through implementation. As an example, if you receive an infraction today, that process will have to flow through the POA process. But once we define and stand up the APS process, all infractions from that date forward would have to flow through the APS system program.
Okay, so after the hearing, if the individual wishes to appeal further, what would be their recourse?
Mr. Mayor, the hearing is final. At that point, screening first, then to the hearing process, and that decision is final.
Okay, and what's the difference between that system and the current POA system? So there can be an appeal, can there not? After after a discussion with a prosecutor, you can go to the JP and have your case heard. So does this remove the ability for another level of appeal that may have been there under the POA system?
Mr. Mayor, that is correct. In the current system, it goes through the justice of peace. If that resolution is not satisfactory, you can appeal that. In the new system, once reviewed by the hearing officer, that decision is final.
Is there a way to add an appeal to a justice of the peace should they not be pleased with the result? It just seems as though we're removing a layer of appeal, and I don't think I'm terribly comfortable with that.
Mr. Mayor, so the screening is, no, there's not. So the screening is the first stage, and then that resolves to the hearing, and that's the final step in the process for an APS.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Luloff. Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thanks for the report. I'm pleased to see us moving in this direction. We've, I think, needed the APS for a long time. In Ottawa, I know other municipalities are doing it now, and it's great to see us moving in this direction as well. It has been hard to enforce some of those bylaw issues because of the provincial model that has existed. And I guess some questions for me is, would this eventually be able to be expanded to things like zoning issues that we're seeing, or property standards issues? Where we're seeing sort of unsafe bunkhouses, waste management issues, front yard parking issues. Is that something because I know right now we're starting red light cameras, parking, and automated speed enforcement, but are other categories possible for this type of system in the future?
So, Mr. Mayor, so the simple answer is some are yes. So from a property standards, those could be. The other ones are really governed by legislation in terms of what would be applicable to fall into this program or not. As I illustrated in the presentation, things have changed over time. So in 2007 was the first introduction the system for parking now in 2022 ASE red light camera. So as more opportunities come up where we can bring more into that process, we would certainly bring that back to committee and council for implementation where it's warranted.
There might be some efficiencies there. That's good to hear. The other question I had, and I'll likely just put an inquiry at the end as to not hold this up or anything like that. But there's been a lot of discussion about ability to pay based on income. I know some other jurisdictions do this now. I'll put an inquiry on just to see if that's a possibility based on income. If you make very low income and receiving a fine, is there a percentage compared to another fine that you might receive that maybe we might be able to implement? Is there any comment from staff on that? Or I guess there's some more time that needed to investigate whether it's possible here in Ontario?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, we would need a little bit of time to kind of do that and see what that impact looks like.
Okay, thanks for that. And just the last question is, a lot of times we have active residents that are pointing out bylaw infraction issues and that are a concern for communities and they're active in their neighborhoods. What's the ability for them to, I guess, submit evidence or issues to the municipality under this system where there's not as much it's not an onerous process, I guess, to have either bylaw officer on site, but evidence that's submitted for things that are occurring in neighborhoods. Is that possible now? I know in some cases that happens, but I'm just wondering in the future, is there more that might be done on that side of things in terms of active residents in communities?
Mr. Mayor, if I understand it properly or correctly, so again, the APS system is meant for when there's a dispute of when the infraction is already issued. So at that point, that's where it kind of flows into this process. I think what you're speaking to is prior infraction being issued, which is kind of outside this system that you have before you today.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested in more information from our staff team on that side of things. Obviously, how these infractions get issued in the first place will affect the amount that we deal with. And so it's just interesting for me to know more of what residents can do, if they're empowered or not in this way on the bylaw side. So thanks, Mayor. It's a great report and pleased to support it today.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Councillor Gower.
Thank you, Mayor. In the staff presentation, you mentioned we have substantially less justices of the peace in Ottawa. My understanding is in pre-pandemic, there were 4 and now there are 2. And we are seeing delays and I assume things being bumped. Actually, I know of a noise ticket that was thrown out because of the delay. Do we have any sense of how often that's happening, that things aren't being heard from a city perspective? How often things are getting bumped? What kind of things are getting thrown out without even being heard because of the lack of JPs?
Mr. Mayor, we don't have any definitive data because some of that is data that that's not privy to us in terms of what goes through the system and be thrown out.
Okay. If we didn't have a shortage of justices of the peace, if it was properly staffed, would staff still be looking to change this system?
Mr. Mayor, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
And the report goes into some details about the remuneration for hearing officers. I was curious about what is the profile of a hearing officer? What kind of people, like I'm not looking for a specific job requirements or so on, but who would we be looking for in other cities? Who typically, what's the profile of a good hearing officer?
So the profile of a hearing officer is typically, from our experience in consulting with other municipalities, it's people with arbitration, mediation experience, somebody that comes from a legal background. And more often than not, it's people at the tail end of their career or just having had exited a career that are still looking to participate in the workforce. And they've shown a lot of success given the model where you can kind of scale up or down in terms of how many hours you work to support the municipality. So.
And is there any risk, like have we looked into, are those people available? Is there any risk about not being able to hire up to meet the timelines that are in front of us for the recommendations?
So the typical strategy used is to try to appoint a sufficient number of hearing officers to work on average about 5 to 10 days per month. And then if volume scales up and people are willing to take on that additional workload, they can do so. So for our instance, we would staff up to around roughly 30 hearing officers at the full run rate of the program, and typically only need about 10 on any given day-to-day basis.
Okay, and I assume the recruitment would be similar to, say, if we're going out for a committee of adjustment members or adjudicators, would be similar. We'd be doing that on at the start of a term or on a as needed basis. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. The last thing I wanted to ask, just from a public perspective, if I had a parking ticket that I wanted to contest, what does that process look like in front of a hearing officer? I think there's a virtual option, or how many people can you just describe it? Like what would the public encounter through this process?
So it'd be essentially with a hearing officer would meet with a resident. The resident has the option to bring counsel with them if they choose to do so. And then on the flip side, the hearing officer can opt to bring the officer who issued the ticket in the case of a parking ticket, let's just say. So the model would be, if it's in person, either in sort of a wicket type model where you're meeting one-on-one with a hearing officer, and if it's done virtually, it's roughly the same thing.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Gower. Councillor Leeper.
Thank you very much. So I note, I'm really pleased to see the prevention of political interference, very bluntly named document as part of what we're approving today, essentially carrying over the same hands-off approach that we currently have. My understanding is that if we are trying to influence parking ticket decisions, that will now be a code violation as opposed to a municipal act violation.
Mr. Chair, that's correct. It would be similar to the existing provincial offenses conflict of interest policy. It would be incorporated into your members' code of conduct, not a municipal conflict of interest act, if that's what the member was referring to.
Okay, so different penalties would apply if someone is unwise enough to reach out to one of the arbitration officers and try to influence a decision. So we'd now be subject only to the penalties that are outlined in the code of conduct.
Generally speaking, that's correct. Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. And then I note the prevention of political interference policy applies to individual members of council. I am just wondering, and this, I apologize for being a little academic on this one, but what are council's powers over the arbitrators? To what degree can council direct their decisions? And what are the guardrails on making sure that council is behaving appropriately?
Mr. Mayor, the council would have similar powers as it would have over, for example, your license committee as it exists today, not involved in the individual direction of decisions, but the overall structure, which would come to council typically at mid-governance report to see what the status of that particular committee is, or as the hearing officers is. It would be a high level involvement, not into the weeds of a particular matter or how decisions are being made. But certainly the supervisory role would still be maintained through governance. Would
council have the purview under this new system, because we're dealing with a municipally appointed arbitrator rather than a justice of the peace? Obviously, we can't tell justices of the peace what to do, but could a bunch of tickets, could council direct that a bunch of tickets be eliminated? Let's say everything to do, all parking tickets to do with Tulip Festival, council directs that those be voided if we had an opportunity as a walk-on or something like that. Is there anything to prevent us from doing that?
Mr. Chair, I would have to consider that further, but my preliminary response would be that would be potentially running afoul of the conflict of interest policy that would be in place at the time, directing enforcement and ultimately directing the administration of those tickets that are deliberately being processed through an independent tribunal, so to speak, similar to the independence of a court process.
Okay. I'd be interested in hearing more of that. I do like the fact that council can't tell justices of the peace what to do. So we have that strict separation of powers that sort of underlies Western liberal democracy. But I would like some comfort that we are prevented from getting involved with the arbitrators. I'll support this today, but something to follow up on. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Leeper. Councillor Tierney.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and great questions by my colleague, Councillor Leeper. Just looking at this overall, we all know the challenges of the speed of processing. I think that's one of the big factors. Are we going to see quicker times from ticket to mailbox? Is that one of the goals?
Mr. Mayor, from this part of the equation, I'll refer to as the equation. This is the back end process when you dispute. So really, we're not touching that part of it. I will take the liberty just to say that we are focusing on making improvements there as well. And one of the things that we've done this year is with Roger, my colleague, when we moved the Joint Processing Center to the City of Ottawa, took that over from Toronto. That's a step in improving that process on that side of the equation.
Absolutely. And we'll save that for a presentation of transportation. There's some moves coming afoot to speed that process up, which is good. And I'll take this opportunity as a public service announcement. We do not issue tickets by text message for going 2 kilometers an hour over the speed limit. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Luloff.
Thank you very much. Is there any provincial funding attached to help offset the costs of extra staff for this administration?
Mr. Mayor, no, this is a fully funded program within the revenue that's collected through those infractions.
Okay. Well, I suppose I do really like the idea of making the system faster and more efficient, because like sitting around and waiting for an adjudication is taxing on people. And I do like the explicit separation of powers as discussed in Councillor Leeper's line of questioning. But I really don't want to do this at the expense of fairness. I don't like the idea of removing a level of appeal to a justice of the peace. I don't think that there's any replacement of that ability to appeal before a provincial justice of the peace. And I don't really like the idea of taking on more expenses and hiring more staff to fix something that is essentially a provincial issue. We've done this before. We're basically subsidizing a transfer of patients at hospitals with ambulances in hospital care, and I feel like this is scope creep. I think that if there was a way to do this, in order to ensure that we're not removing that level of appeal, I could probably swallow taking on more expenses to make this more efficient. But I really don't want to make this decision at the expense of fairness and the ability for people to be able to have their case heard before a provincial justice of the peace. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Menard.
Sorry to get on the list again here, Mayor. Just Councillor Gower had a question that I wanted to follow up on, and it's just the typical process of receiving, let's just say, a parking ticket. So, because right now, if you get a parking ticket, you've got the early bird payment, okay, and then you've got the regular payment. And in the past, residents would be able to go in to speak to an officer on site here at City Hall, and they'd talk to them about the ticket. And if there was an issue that come up, sometimes they could half that ticket. They could cut the ticket in half, or sometimes a different amount. I think they used to be able to eliminate it. I don't know if that's stopped now, but so like, is that still going to be possible under this system, or is the hearing officer taking over like that process as well? This is, I guess, in the first, 45 days of a ticket payment?
So the same services will be provided under this program. And in a lot of ways, what we offer today under the parking program, which is called the first attendance facility, which is what you're speaking to in terms of meeting with a city employee to review that ticket. And that officer can either affirm the penalty amount, reduce it, potentially cancel it if there's some sort of error context around that situation, or provide an extension of time to pay or a payment plan in certain cases. So that's essentially the exact same process in the first stage of a review under the APS program. So from a client perspective, the experience in that first stage is essentially the exact same as what exists today.
Okay. And just so I'm clear, the hearing officers that we're hiring, are those the people now doing that, or are we keeping in place that other system that exists right now with the same people doing that job? Sorry if I confused that.
Yeah, so it's a two-stage process. So the screening officers would, in essence, replace that step of what's called first attendance facility, but in all practical purposes, the process is the exact same. And then the secondary step is what is staffed by those hearing officers that are independent to the city that would facilitate, and we would schedule them in based on the demand of booking those appointments to facilitate that.
So to Councillor Luloff's point about like an additional appeal process, I understand what he's saying provincially, but in this case, a resident could theoretically go in, dispute an infraction, early under that, within that 45 days. If they're not happy there, it still can go to the next stage, which is the hearing. So there's kind of a two-stage process that could still occur in that way. Okay, that's helpful. Just on the processing cost comparison. So I understand there's efficiencies here. We're expected to, I guess, efficiency wise, save 35%. The processing costs are expected to be approximately 35% lower under an APS program relative to POA. That's not savings for us, is it? It's just we're going to manage this process at a cost neutral, in a cost neutral way, or explain to me more, I guess, this 35% lower efficiencies that we're getting going to APS versus the POA.
So, Mr. Mayor, I would couch this in the context of a continuous improvement. So today we're seeing the volume do one of these, like the curve on the volume of ASE specifically is going this way. So today it cost us just over $8 million through the POA system. Because the volume is growing up, if we don't go to the APS system, I would have to bring forward a budget pressure in the next cycle to address that volume. By moving to this more efficient, streamlined, effective process with APS, I'm now able to manage that growth with the existing resources because it's more efficient.
Okay, that's
So
a
as
really
opposed
great
to-
explanation.
yeah,
Thank you for that. That's helpful. So there is a savings here because we're seeing more tickets, I guess, as a result of the new technologies. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Curry.
So that was really exactly my question, but I just want to ask one other thing. So even if you look at that difference of $3 million that you've got there, 8,000,003 versus 5,000,003, right? So yes, the numbers are going up, but is that just simply our cost? Because I understand that police will also not have to necessarily be at all of these meetings, all of these trials or whatever you call them. So is that calculating all of our savings that into that number?
Mr. Mayor, this is just ours in terms of the city component that we control, not the component of the Ottawa Police.
But it'd be interesting to figure out what else other savings there are, though. You know, we can definitely watch for that, I think. Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is the motion carried then?
I'll dissent, Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Luloff. Thank you, team. Let's move on to item 5.1, the 2024 asset management plans, and I understand there's a presentation for that. I'll give you a moment to get set up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good morning, members of committee. Today, we are bringing forward the 2024 asset management plans, which covers 8 services from across the city. With me today, I have Sue Johns, our Director of Asset Management, who will provide a short presentation for committee today. We also have our important partner, Isabel Jasmine, our Deputy City Treasurer. We also have in the room and online various representatives from the department in case there are any questions for them today. Our legacy of asset management planning at the city has ensured that all assets are consistently maintained to be safe and to provide service to meet the needs of the community. The 2024 asset management plans outline important information about these assets. They provide council with the data that will guide and inform future decisions. Our assets are fundamental to the services the city provides to its citizens, and sharing this information with council will be critical as we move into the next stage of provincial asset management legislation in 2025. It is important to note that the purpose of this report is for council to approve the current state of our assets. Council's endorsement and approval of these plans recognize the existing state of the assets and their projected funding requirements. Over the next year, we will build on these plans, which will propose the adoption of target levels of service and accompanying funding strategies. I will now hand it over to Sue Johns, who will go over an overview of the report and the plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy, and good morning, committee members. As Tammy mentioned, in 2018, the province introduced a new regulation to require municipalities to standardize their practice of asset management to ensure consistency across the province and enable easy collection of data. Staff welcome this legislation, and it has not come out of the blue. Ottawa staff were at the table with other municipalities shaping this regulation. The city's also been practicing asset management long before this regulation, going back to amalgamation. 2018's provincial regulation is a new evolution where cities must document the conditions of all of their assets. Oh, could I have the next slide, please? Sorry. There we go. Of all of their assets during phase 1, and then propose target levels of service, funding strategies, and risks as part of the phase 2 work. The first part of phase 1, there were 4 asset management plans approved by council in 2022 for drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and transportation. This met the first requirement of the regulation. Today, we are presenting 8 asset management plans to complete our phase 1 work. To meet the requirement of phase 2, we will bring back all 12 asset management plans to council for approval in 2025. Next slide, please. In accordance with the regulation, every asset management plan has to be endorsed by the executive lead of the municipality and approved by resolution of municipal council. Today, staff are recommending the approval of 8 asset management plans. Approving these plans documents the existing state of these assets, their projected funding requirements as the provincial legislation requires. Provincial and federal funding agreements, programs, for example, are now asking us to verify that we have approved our asset management plan. So people are looking for this work to be completed. Next slide, please. So these are the 8 services: community and social services, emergency and protective services, government services and IT, green space and forest services, library services, recreation and culture, solid waste, and transit services. While a lot of work went into gathering the data, documenting the condition and the funding associated with these 8 asset management plans, the information that we're going to present today is not completely new to council. This is an assembly of work that we are doing always, and in some cases, it's work that council has seen before. What we are talking about in these asset management plans is buildings, fleet, the infrastructure that supports our transit system, as well as specialized equipment and IT. The difference of this asset management plan compared to other documents that we've presented in the past is this collects everything into one big picture and presents it in a new way. So first, a minute on how the heck did we do this? So we worked with people who are close to the services that are listed there. They know the service and they know how their assets are supporting the delivery of that service. Of course, there's a huge role for our finance colleagues who keep track of how much we spend and forecast how much we have to in the future to spend. We have in our own inventories information about the condition of assets, fleet assets, and building assets. This work aligns with the work that you've already seen on the Transit Long Range Financial Plan, aligns with the Solid Waste Master Plan. There's a lot of work that was done preparing the Development Charges Bylaw. That's included in this. The climate resiliency work, there is an inclusion of climate in here as a requirement of the legislation. And of course, the facility management audit, we're aligning with that as well. That's the reason why you see many staff from across the corporation in committee room today or in the Zoom call, because this is their asset management plans. I have the asset management service, but the content is really reflecting the corporate services. These people are here because of the work that they do related to assets, but they are all asset managers. They all have a role in the costs and how our services are delivered. This was an integrated effort, and I want to thank everyone who is involved. We are confident in our methodology and the good data it produced, and it will be valuable for future council decisions. Next slide, please. Before getting into what the data shows, I'm going to take a minute to outline what factors and drivers are behind some of the trends that we are seeing in our asset management plans. Sound and strategic planning for the future requires us to acknowledge and understand what are the factors contributing to where we are today. A lot of the factors and challenges discussed in these asset management plans are not unique to Ottawa. All Ontario municipalities are doing their AMPs leading up to a July 1st, 2024 due date, and certainly this is a Canada-wide conversation. Many of you on council have spoken about these trends. We've seen a lot of content in the media about them. We hear other municipalities talking about their own situation. Our infrastructure is aging and it needs renewal. We all are facing the reality of climate change and understanding that our assets and their ability to provide service, they were not designed to face the challenges that climate change is presenting. The cost of renewal and replacement work is increasing. And this new legislation is a change in itself because it requires us to report on all of our assets, including growth, which is not how we've done our previous reporting. And there is a lot of policies and standards that we have to incorporate. So in summary, a lot of our asset challenges today reflect broader trends across Canadian cities, but they do have an impact on how well our assets will be able to deliver service in the future. And they show a need for us to have financial strategies, but as well as creative non-financial strategies for how to deal with this over the next decade. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of a wayfinding slide that helps you navigate through the attached documents, which are each of the 8 asset management plans. So each one is presented in a consistent format to deliver this information for each of the services. What's the inventory of assets? How old are they? What condition are they in? How much would they cost to replace them today? What services are they supporting? How do we measure those services? And what will it cost to maintain our current portfolio of assets in the same condition as they are today for the next 10 years? You will see the details for each of the 8 services in the attachments to this report. Next slide, please. So here's the summary. What does it show us? What do we learn from our asset management plans? First of all, it shows that Council's commitment to investment in infrastructure has resulted in buildings and fleet, things like pools, arenas, IT systems, transit infrastructure, everything you can think of. The infrastructure that is safe, it provides important service to our community, and overall, it's in fair to good conditions. That's the tally across all 8 of those services. Each plan provides a lot of information on the condition of the assets that provide the service, the costs, levels of service, all assuming no changes. Each of the asset management plans has their own condition rating and goes into detail based on their asset classes. These are things like buildings and fleet and equipment, those subcategories, things like fire stations, long-term care, a wide range of recreation facilities, our landfill, our transit system, our libraries. It includes fleet that supports bylaw, transit, paramedic, and fire. We encourage you to take a look at this information to see what assets we own and how they're doing. Our current asset management planning, in which we prioritize and bring recommendations to council every year at budget, ensures all our assets are maintained safely. Next slide, please. The other thing the asset managements provide us is financial information. We have information in each plan about what the forecasted expenditures need to be related to capital growth, enhancements and renewal, as well as operating expenditures, and then the planned investment we have on the books for the next 10 years. At a high level, when we compare the forecast for investment and the forecast for needs, there's a difference of about $3 billion over these 8 services over a 10-year period. This graphic shows you the breakdown of contributions to that number by service. This is not a brand new number. You have seen some of these numbers before. You'll notice that almost half of the pie is made up of transit, which we knew from the transit LRFP work, and the solid waste master plan. That makes up about half. This compiled estimate will help committee and council in future decision-making. And this funding difference doesn't represent a single decision to make today, but it shows our current balance, it shows our projections, assuming no changes between risk, cost, and service. There's no affordability lens that's been applied, no changes in our asset, and no changes to how we deliver service. This is a snapshot in time. It's a measurement. It's not a bill or an invoice to be paid. And due to the new provincial legislation, the difference is not comparable to gaps that we may have talked about in the past because of what's included in them. This is information for us to plan for the future. Next slide, please. The other way to look at that funding difference is on themes, and this is one example. The difference is made up of 3 parts in this example, providing a cumulative difference of pressure that we feel related to growth, which is activities that we need to build a brand new asset or to expand the capacity of our existing assets to be able to accommodate new development at the same level of service as is enjoyed by our existing community. The upgrade and enhancement category is activities that improve assets so that they have a higher performance level. And these can meet new policy objectives or comply with regulatory requirements. Things like when we do a renewal, you probably want to meet, we'll prioritize to meet accessibility, for example. That would be considered an enhancement. Because renewal is rehabilitate existing assets back to their original quality and functionality. This is like for like. So you can understand that gap, there are differences in each of those themed categories. The regulation requires municipalities to report the funding requirements for growth. We have to include growth for all renewal as well as enhancements, which is, as I mentioned, new policies and things like climate change. The gap gives us an understanding of the gap, and looking at it in this way gives us an idea of what strategies we'd have to try and address it in focused ways. Each of the growth, renewal, and enhancement categories is important to managing our infrastructure in a way that aligns with our long-term service delivery and our community well-being. And if we looked at how would we change these numbers, there's a wide range of financial and non-asset-based service delivery strategies that could address these forecasted differences. Council will always decide the appropriate balance between cost, risk, and service. Next slide, please. These 8 asset management plans provide council with information, and the next set of 12 in 2025 will support council with more actionable planning. We'll be back to you in a year's time to approve those to comply with the legislation. In advance of that, we will be engaging council to talk about asset funding and needs, what risks are associated with each of these assets, where our needs exceed our funding, and talking about risk mitigation to ensure long-term sustainability and service delivery. There has historically been strong alignment between asset management planning and the development of our long-range financial plans to keep critical infrastructure in a state of good repair while remaining affordable and sustainable. So all of this information is a huge input to the city's long-range financial plan work that's coming in 2025. The long-range financial plan for both tax and rate will be companion reports to the 2025 asset management plans. And we'll look at a wide range of funding options. To execute this work within the corporation, we have the Comprehensive Asset Management Steering Committee that will lead the work to 2025, because the service delivery experts are the ones that have the best idea of how to preserve service and what changes could be possible. There'll be a lot of iterative and flexible option consideration to try and help us make sure that we're presenting to council the best strategies. Non-financial strategies, as examples, are things that we could do to modify demand, lower costs, or extend asset life. Things strategically that we could do that it could improve the performance and longevity of our assets without a big capital investment. We have a lot of ways we can go at this difference and our comfort level with it, which will come with exploring more risk. But the community and council's input are important to our ongoing success in asset management to make sure that our future choices balance that cost, risk, and service triangle. All that to say, there's a lot of options at hand, and this is really the first step in presenting you what the data shows us today. Next slide, please. And it doesn't end in 2025. The obligation, the legislation includes an annual report to council to update and report on the status of implementing the asset management plans every year. So there will be opportunities to talk about risk and priority. And like we exercise that we have to complete in 2025, every 5 years after that, there will be a full update of all the asset management plans, the target levels of service, and the funding strategies. We will always be here to support council with these important decisions. Next slide, please. It's my last slide. Things change. We experience climate change and tornadoes and floods. We've had a pandemic. We always want to have up-to-date IT supporting efficient operations. We have funding announcements from different levels of government. We buy new buildings. Council makes decisions often, and we are in a living city. Our services adapt as the city changes. And because things change, council is committed to a plan that revisits strategic plans on a regular basis. The buildings and equipment supporting these 8 services show they are in good to fair condition today. We have an opportunity to consider what has changed, what's the forecast for growth in each iteration, and how do we ensure that our community has the services they need? What buildings and equipment do we need to support those services? We want our long-term plans to reflect our current needs and plan for the future. Council has put in place regular review cycles to allow plans to adjust and to reflect change. This new regulation requires the same thing. The 2024 asset management plans give council information to make strategic decisions easier by bringing together renewal, enhancement, and growth needs into one document for each of these 8 services. Council can use this information to ensure the assets we rely on continue to provide safe service to our community. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Councillor Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm very excited to see these asset management plans come forward today, as I'm sure many of us are. This is where we make the invisible visible. So all that we assumed and all that we didn't know about how to make financial decisions when it comes to our assets, we now have better information than we did yesterday. And that is so important. When I was first elected, I remember going to Sue's team and asking about the Nepean Museum. And my question will focus on the Parks and Rec or Recreational and Cultural Facilities section. But I remember going to Sue's team and saying, oh, so we're replacing the roof on the Nepean Museum. So how long do we make these types of repairs before we renew the entire building? And Sue said to me, oh, well, we actually don't yet have a decision point for that type of change. But we will. We're doing these asset management plans that are coming forward in 2024. And I thought, I'm really looking forward to having those moments in time where we can make strategic decisions about when to repair versus renew. Because obviously, eventually we want to make sure we're not throwing good money after bad. So we're in a good position today. So that being said, the information that we didn't have in 2022 now looks like a pretty big price tag for recreation and cultural facilities. And I wanted to ask, even though we're not going to talk too much about the strategies today, whether there will be implications for community rentals, or whether the community rental rates will stay more to offset the operating costs. I ask that because we do have already many barriers to community members renting these facilities, whether it's the rates or the availability. And I just want to ensure that we aren't going to look at this price tag and go, whoops, Daisy, we better get all hands on deck here, because I don't think our community groups could offset those costs.
Mr. Bear, we have Dan Chenier, the General Manager of Rec Culture and Facilities on the line.
Mr. Mayor, the rental rates for most community centers, and and community facilities, and I'll exempt arenas from that because arenas really is one area because of past pursuit of P3s where our rental rates were really developed to reflect cost recovery. But for pools and for community centers and gymnasiums, the user fee that is applied against those, particularly for community use, is not a reflection of the cost of providing the service. It has been a rate established with, in most cases, a generous subsidy built into them in order to make it affordable for community. So the strategy going forward, and we are currently reviewing rental rates and consulting with community, have generally told us that those rates need to continue to have a subsidy in order to encourage community animation. So wouldn't be our strategy, and currently isn't as part of our review, to try to recover incremental costs of providing the facility through user fees in that way.
Beauty, I'm glad to hear that. And the other thing that we've been noticing in College Ward, and I'm confident that other councillors have felt the same changes, is for storage for our community groups, our sports groups used to be able to store their materials on site in various miscellaneous pre-amalgamation bunky structures or whatever lean-tos that we have out in Nepean. And, you know, now when we're doing the renewal on these projects, we're, from what I understand, not providing those storage spaces in the same way, which is causing community groups to scramble. Is this something that, as you're looking through the asset management plan, that you're also keeping in mind, or is there any relationship to that cost that is going to persist under this new information?
Mr. Mayor, there are two things happening there. One is that council has approved a leasing policy for the city of Ottawa that I believe came out of an audit some years ago. And so we are implementing across the city harmonization of what groups pay for rental space. So we still allow rental space where it's available, where there is surplus space, but what we are applying is a per square foot uniform rate to those groups. The other thing that is happening is that in many cases, older buildings that were either at end of life or had fallen out of use, and I am aware of the one in Councillor Johnson's area particularly, which was a field house that had fallen out of use. As those get redeveloped, and particularly for field houses, communities are looking to convert what was at one time change space for outdoor rinks or for wading pools into actual programmable space. And as we are building back field houses into programmable space, there would be quite a premium to include community storage. And in most cases, that is a service that was available to only a very few groups. We don't have the capacity to really provide that. Then in those cases, it's largely unaffordable to build additional storage space on these facilities. And in those cases, we are phasing out the storage.
Okay, I'll look forward to continuing that conversation. I see my colleagues have questions. I just have my final question around transit, just expressing interest to know that the transit capital assets moving forward will be also receiving that AODA, that accessibility compliance lens. We have some current bus stops in College Ward that can't be accessed by people using a mobility device. And when we asked for that upgrade, we've been told that OC Transpo doesn't currently have it in the budget to do those types of upgrades for their bus shelters this year. So just hoping to get a comment that we have that lens applied on this plan moving forward.
Mr. Mayor, I invited our colleagues from Transit Services. I believe we have a number of them on the Zoom call today.
I see Pat Scrimger approaching.
Oh, Pat's here.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, all new bus stops that we build are always built to be consistent with the City of Ottawa Municipal Accessibility Plan, COMAP, that you approved earlier today. And over time, we will be able to gradually refit older bus stops to provide accessibility standards. Comments from councillors certainly help in prioritizing that work.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Curry.
Thank you. Yeah. So the climate in the report under the climate change category, there's the number that there's $179 million gap. Okay. So that's over 10 years and that's capital and operating. Does that number, so that's only $18 million a year. So over 10 years, it's 179, right? Does that number contemplate Hydro Ottawa's offer to do the deep building retrofits?
Mr. Mayor, there is some data from city staff included in the calculation of the 179. The 179 data is retrieved from work that the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario has done for municipalities across. Does it specifically include that number? No, there is not an unwrap of that 179 that shows that as a line item.
So we don't challenge those numbers at all.
We had an obligation to include something that met the requirements of the regulation, and we didn't have data of our own to submit. We used the data, some of the data that we did have from plans that we have prices for, and on a more global basis for the incremental costs for climate change on buildings, we used the FAO data.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Curry. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a few questions. First of all, this is a phenomenal report. If you think about the amount of work that went into this, involving so many departments and analysis and assessment, this is excellent. And unlike Councillor Johnson, who gets excited by this, I'm enlightened because the public needs to know exactly what you've presented here. So I want to commend staff for great work. The challenge is how we address this in the years to come. And I just want to joke, I have Ms. Johns on speed dial, as she can attest to. We speak frequently about some of the renewal deficiencies in River Ward, and I appreciate her patience and excellence in trying to address a number of matters. Can staff break down the $3 billion net difference in the report? Talks about that as a sum of growth needs, renewal needs, and enhancement needs. The renewal is the one I'm concerned about because that talks about existing assets that exist in all wards and the gaps that exist. Do you know of the $3 billion, what amount the renewal piece is contributing to that?
Mr. Mayor, we do have a table in the presentation and also in the report. So if you take a look at the way the information is expressed is we have information around growth pressures, renewal, and the enhancements that speak to have there been updated regulations since the last time this asset was put into service. And so the renewal piece for the next 10 years is estimated at about it's probably around $800 million. There's a bit of granularity that we don't have on some of those services. So that's a bit of an estimate for today.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate that. And finally, just as far as next steps, how we go about addressing this gap, can you just elaborate on that piece again, just to clarify for me?
I mentioned the CAM steering committee, and I think that's going to be internally for staff. That's going to be the vehicle that advances us in 12 different paths because of our 12 plans. We will each be working within our portfolios to get to the requirement that satisfies our obligation for July 1st, 2025. How we do that, there's a wide range of possibilities based on what work we already have planned and underway, what work we have already done. I think we are going to continue the excellent collaboration. I appreciate your comments. Thank you, Councillor. To to make sure that we're sharing opportunities, especially in the creativity of the non-financial strategies of things that we could do that don't cost money, that might save us money. But I think the path forward for staff is certainly based on the work that each of the service areas will do. Council has access to this data and how you see fit to continue to use it. I believe it's going to be a reference point for us from here forward. When we have reports that come forward to council for approval, there's a section called asset management implications in those reports, and we're going to refer back to the asset management plans. We're going to make sure you make the connection of the decisions that you make are related to this asset management plan. And if you wanted to go dig through it, you would be able to. We will always have a shared, transparent data set that we can refer to. It's hard for me to extrapolate beyond what we have to do by 2025. I think the usefulness of this is going to be much beyond that as we get more familiar with it. I think in our day-to-day business, it's going to help us a lot. Our 2025 requirement is we have to add to the documentation. Here's how much we need to spend. Here's how much we plan to spend. And here's the risks of not spending or of not managing, how we mitigate those risks. And there are mitigations for not being able to. And a lot of things will not roll out precisely as they're documented in this report, right? Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Mayor. To echo what Councillor Brockington was saying, thank you very much for the incredible work in this document and the enlightening, eye-opening state it puts upon us and the responsibility it puts upon us. I do have a couple questions, but the thing that I recognize in the document, and I kind of appreciate the tone that you set, where you wrote that these 2024 AMPs do not seek council decisions on changing funding strategies. However, council's endorsement and approval of these plans recognize the existing state of assets and their projected funding requirements. Understanding the current forecasted estimates will support future decisions in 2025 and beyond. And I think that's kind of like the wake-up call that I feel is being sent with this document. Because I know that your solutions pertain to both financial and non-financial strategies. Those financial strategies, I can imagine what those are. Those non-financial strategies are a little bit more elusive, but I imagine they may lead to either taking on greater levels of risk or redefining our service standards or any number of things that I know will have an impact both on residents who use these assets and taxpayers who will pay for these assets. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I do have a few questions. They pertain primarily to, I think, community and social services. So as I was looking at the tables of the documents, one thing I measured was for each of the 8 portfolios, you referred to how much the total replacement cost of the assets would be. And then you also projected what is our current 10-year investment for those. And of course, the gap per portfolio equals up to $3 billion. But the thing I noticed for each of the 8 portfolios, where you identified total replacement costs and current investment projections, those 10-year planned investments averaged around 25 to 40% of total replacement costs, with one major discrepancy, actually 2, but one major discrepancy was community and social services, where the planned investment of, I think, $45 million represents only 7% of the total replacement cost. And so that kind of stuck out a little bit for me. I know that in terms of how much each of those replacement costs, that total $3 billion, the $45 million required for community social services is a small piece of that pie. However, knowing that, as you say, the community and social services enable support for our most vulnerable residents, I had 2 questions. One, why is the 10-year projected investment for community social services only 7% of the total projected replacement needs? That's my first question.
Mr. Mayor, thank you, Councillor Devine, for using information to do analysis. You're proof that this information can inform us and give us questions to ask. The overall condition of the community and social services assets right now, their buildings, and they have one fleet, is in the middle of good. And so that could be one reason. There could be other reasons. And I'm happy to unwrap that a little bit more. They're in the technical report that is attached. There's a lot of detail, but why do we plan to spend less there than other places? My first reaction is it looks like they have fewer needs, right? And the second part of that is I know that, for instance, in childcare and long-term care, there's very regulated environments in terms of what those facilities have to be like. So that would keep things up as well in terms of investment. But I can't answer that for you today, but I applaud you for making that observation.
Thanks. I wasn't looking for the applause. A follow-up question to that. I'm going to imagine that however much we decide to raise for the 3 billion, that we're likely going to spread that out somewhat evenly. If currently we are only investing for 7% of replacement needs for community social services, and if community social services tends to our most vulnerable, is there any perceived or potential risk of having a lower than average investment for that sector to that community?
Our annual budget brings forward our most critical needs. And so if there are needs in that community and social services portfolio, they will come forward to council for approval. It is our intent that our assets are providing it's all about service to our community, vulnerable or non-vulnerable community. It's all about service at a good level of service, and the service levels themselves define how they measure their service. And our recommendations for asset renewal in asset investment are based on what those needs are and ensuring that that service is consistent.
Thank you. One more question about community and social services. I noticed that when you're projecting your investment needs for each of the portfolios, you project for growth, enhancement, and renewal. However, for community and social services, it was the only one that had 0 projected for growth. So over 10 years. So perhaps I don't understand the portfolio that well, but why over 10 years are we projecting no further investment on CSSD for growth related investment?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Mayor. In community and social services, as Sue stated, we're highly regulated. At this time in children's services, long-term care, we're regulated to the number of facilities that we currently maintain. We have, without provincial guidelines and provincial funding, we would have no plans to expand those services.
Okay, and I'm not sure if that means, however, that as the city invests and as the population grows in different areas, there may not be such services in those areas. I'm not sure. I'll speak more about that another time. My last question, on the issue of enhancement, growth, and renewal, Councillor Brockington was mentioning under renewal, we replace like for like. Whereas in growth-related areas, we build new things according to new standards and so forth. I live in the community that will get like for like renewal replacements. Typically, it's in the established wards where the replacement is like for like. And I've been down that path many times where a park renewal or a facility renewal is, we'll pretty much replace brick for brick. There'll be new bricks, but we're not going to expand, we're not going to modify, we're not going to modernize whatsoever.
That's time, Councillor. So if you want to ask your question, go ahead, but that's time.
Thank you, sir. Briefly, does replacement of like for like generally mean that in these areas where we get like for like, the facilities or the new assets that will be invested in will be less modern, less something than whatever we get that is not like for like in growth?
Mr. Mayor, anytime a rehabilitation project advances, we are bound to implement it to today's standards. And so even within renewal, which we define as like for like, it would be older and standard of that day, renewed to standard of today.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Mayor. Just really appreciate all the work that staff have put into this. I know it's been a long time coming, and last term we also did some asset management plan renewal for some areas, but just having it in front of us like this tells a story, and you paint a picture of what we need to do to improve. I just want to touch on 2 points. One is around the climate change piece, which I know you've highlighted in this report, and then the other is on our park infrastructure. On climate change, I guess for each report, there's a line in there that we say some climate change costs have been or expected in the future to be at least partially covered from upper levels of government. Those recoveries aren't factored into the estimates. We're also not factoring into the estimates the potential damage to capital infrastructure or catastrophic extreme weather events, and the capital renewal needs due to accelerated asset deterioration. So things like flooding perhaps, or windstorms that may take down some of our assets. So on that side of things, where are we covering off those potential incidents and costs for ourselves in the future? Because you've done a great job of capturing some of the other pieces that climate change brings. I think there are 3 areas that you've covered off with that, but on those other pieces where there's catastrophic storms, where would the municipality be looking for, I guess, funding or reserving funding for when those events inevitably happen again?
So we are still in the process of identifying what those financial risks are. We're in the early stages of identifying how we're going to report our financial risks in our financial statements, and then also how we budget for it in the future. One-time events are typically funded by reserves. So we have to look at our reserves policy and make sure that we have sufficient funds for those one-time events. But also looking and seeking for funding from senior levels of government when it's an emergency or a catastrophic event. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful information. Thank you, Mayor. The second point I just wanted to raise is around the parks piece. I think this is such a important piece for the municipality because you can have fairly low cost investments, but very high quality of life for people through our parks and through the cultural assets that we've got there, the outdoor assets. One area that I notice is a concern in the recreation and cultural services is our outdoor assets, 40% being poor, it appears, poor condition. And I had talked with staff at the budget last year about our annual budget I think it was called the Capital Repair Fund. And so that's for things like our swing sets, our play structures, pickleball courts, those sorts of things. And that had stayed stagnant, I think, for 8 years. I think it was 8 to 10 years that it stayed relatively stagnant. I had brought a direction last budget that staff be directed to explore the feasibility for additional funding for the parks renewal budget and report back in Q2 of 2024 ahead of the 2025 budget. So I know it's still time to come back on that piece. But just in that area, we have all these old facilities that are really in need of investment, and not a lot of investment compared to other things we invest in, but high quality life delivered as a result of it. So is the plan to invest significantly in those older assets that exist in our parks now and renew them in this plan? Do we see that in here, an increase in that parks renewal fund, that capital repair fund, and in other areas to improve the growth, or I guess improve the assets that exist in our parks?
Mr. Mayor, the asset management plans document our existing plans, our existing actions, right? Our existing needs, our existing plans for investment. There is nothing in there about, are we going to increase anything over anything else? Those decisions are ultimately belong to council. The needs related to the park infrastructure, the pieces that you talk about, many of the playground infrastructure pieces and are governed by Canada Standards Association, CSA standard inspections on a regular basis to make sure that they are safe. And the needs of a certain piece of equipment within a park, if its needs rise to the top, it's addressed because we want the overall park to remain safe for use rather than just taking out things. I think I'm aware of how that feels piecemeal and not an opportunity for an overall reinvestment or reimagining of a park space, a recreation space, but it is efficient investment. It does follow the line of investment that council has given us, and we prioritize those needs based on maintaining safety and making sure the community has these resources to enjoy.
I appreciate that. I do hope that in our 2025 budget, we're seeing a relative increase for those older facilities that have had a similar level of funding that hasn't increased by inflation, I think for almost a decade, to start reinvesting in our areas that have needed it for a very, very long time. That brings high quality life for not a lot of money. So I'll look forward to getting that piece back, and I guess in Q2, and just appreciate all your work on these plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Vice Chair Kitts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll add my thanks for all the work that went into this. Part of what has contributed to the gap, particularly for transit and growth, has been less funding from other levels of government than presumed, correct?
Not necessarily. Like for transit, for example, the ridership has had a significant impact. Stage 2 was expecting to have significantly more ridership to help to pay for it. So that has impacted it. We have received good funding from for transit, for example, and now the permanent transit fund is coming forward. So that has been taken into account into these plans, but we could always use more. Yes.
Okay. I'm just wondering, there's a lot of plans that are up for renewal in the next couple of years, including the long range financial plan. So I'm wondering if we should be more conservative with what we presume from other levels of government, or if that modeling is happening even behind the scenes to say, this is the scenario, you know, where we get X and this is the scenario where we get less than presumed. Because I feel like it's a bit of a dangerous game to put eggs in that basket.
Wherever possible, we only included funding we were aware of. So for example, the permanent transit fund, we can guesstimate how much we would be receiving based on population and ridership.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, is the report carried then? Thank you. Okay, moving to item 7.1, declaration of surplus land, 250 Forest Glade Crescent. We have a couple of delegations, as I understand it. Katie Burkholder Harris, I don't know if you're here or online. Okay. I don't see her present. Okay, Nancy P. and Nick Ilauk. Okay. Chris Allen. Okay, you'd like to come forward and present? Okay, if you would sit at the table, so there's a microphone there, you can.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for giving me a couple of minutes. So all I want to say is that this development in our neighborhood is going to be for transitional housing, which, you know, that's a point that, yes, absolutely, it's an important for the city to take part in. I think the concern that we have in our neighborhood is that there's already two low cost housing units right in this parcel of land that's being discussed. And this area is generally somewhat unsafe. There's been shootings, there's been drug dealings that go down that our neighbors are speaking about. And there's generally a lot of car theft and vandalism that takes place. We're a little bit concerned about the new housing unit and maybe the children, the older children that are going to be there, and how that's going to affect the neighborhood. We're just not sure. When this came about, we were really caught off guard by this whole thing. We weren't sure if there was a consultation process, any alternate uses for this land that were discussed. And it's a really small parcel of land. It's a nice little spot. It's right very central in our neighborhood. And I think we're just a little bit concerned that what ends up coming there is something that may detract from our neighborhood as opposed to benefit the neighborhood. So we'd like to know if there were alternate uses discussed for the land, and if so, what were they? Because we were unable to get that information. And that's really all I wanted to say is it just seems like it came across very quickly. It was sort of dumped on us or pushed on us. And we really just want to try to understand maybe if there's other uses for the land and or if what else was going on there. So it's kind of gotten to this point. I understand there's a need for this stuff, but at the same time, it just feels like it's rushed. There's been no discussion. There's been no consultation with the neighbors, and all the neighbors that are right there are opposed to this because they just don't understand it. They don't understand the benefits to the community. It hasn't been clearly discussed with us, and we're trying to raise our families there in a nice neighborhood, and we're worried this is going to detract from that. We have a bike path and a walking path that goes right through there. There's kids that fly kites in that yard right now. We walk by there all the time, and it's just going to add to that section of our neighborhood that's already a little bit concerning when we go past there with our families. So that's all I wanted to say. What happens from here, I'll leave to your judgment, but I just wanted to make sure I contributed that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Any questions? Okay, is the motion carried? Thank you. There were no in-camera items or notices of motion that I'm aware of. I think we have a couple of inquiries, though. Vice Chair Kitts, you have an inquiry on behalf of Councillor Desroches.
Thank you. So can staff advise what would be required for the city to undertake a competitive request of interest process for cellular tower or providers at the Leitrim, Bowesville, and Linebank Trillium line stations with a goal of improving cellular phone service in the area for residents, businesses, and transit passengers, and providing an alternative source revenue to the city of Ottawa?
Okay, thank you. Councillor Menard, I think you had an inquiry as well.
Thank you, Mayor. I just referenced it earlier during our discussion with the new APS. Our office is aware of the significant asymmetry of the effect that the same fine can have on different residents. For the luxury car illegally parked near Lansdowne, a parking fine might just be the price they're willing to pay to attend an event. For others, a parking ticket fine could be the difference between them being able to afford their grocery bill at the end of the month. Other jurisdictions have addressed this inherent inequality through introducing a system of fines geared to income. Just last year, a survey conducted by Research Co. found that a majority of Canadians support tying speeding ticket fines to income. This suggests there may be an appetite for this approach to fair fines when it comes to things like parking fines. Given that Ottawa is looking to move ahead with an administrative penalty system that allows the city more prerogative when it comes to the administration of penalties, can staff please review both the possibility and feasibility of a sliding scale for parking fines that is geared to income or other potential proxies for ability to pay? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Are there any other inquiries? Any other business? Okay, motion to adjourn. Carried. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup.